Thank you to the conference organisers and especially Dr. Richard Povell for inviting me here to speak today. I'm going to be talking to you, amongst other things, about journeys. So I wanted to start on a personal note by saying that being here means a great deal to me, as it was 20 years ago this autumn that I began my undergraduate studies at Dartington. I also met my wife here, and if I had the time to tell you the twists and turns of our journey together that have brought me back here today, you'd be as surprised as me to be standing here in front of all of you. I want to begin by briefly contextualizing my work. I'm a cinematographer, and I'm a little over halfway through my PhD at the Centre for Moving Image Research at the University of the West of England in Bristol. My research is practice-led, and my subject is cinematographic approaches towards the sublime landscape. Behind me are a few excerpts of work that I have produced over the past 18 months. I have come to understand my practice in this area and my practice-led research in general as a profound physical, emotional, and intellectual journey towards knowledge, or more accurately towards new questions, that will enable me to progress as an artist and to encourage new perspectives on how we, the human, see ourselves within the landscape of the Anthropocene. The nature of my journey into the landscape, as a cinematographer, as a student of philosophy, and as a human at this point in time, is highlighting very specific areas that resonate with themes that I want to talk about today, namely, that how we see ourselves within the landscape influences and empowers how we think and feel about our role in how that landscape does or does not flourish or function. The importance of subjectivity, emotion, and thought being thoroughly interrogated and balanced within an academic framework. The vitality of being both an artist and an academic in the field. Nurturing a symbiosis whereby my practice tests my academic and theoretical ideas, and they both continually inform and inspire each other. The importance of challenging and reinvigorating the meanings of certain words and how we use them in modern language, such as romantic, sublime, and apocalypse. And the urgent need for collaboration between the arts, humanities, and other social sciences and the natural sciences in the presentation and dissemination of overwhelming scientific and empirical data concerning anthropocentric climate change. Starting with the sublime landscape is particularly useful because it visually symbolizes a major crossover in how people looked at the natural world, a clear move from the rational, scientific, and formal approach of the Enlightenment, and the inevitable reaction to that way of thinking, which was Romanticism, and a turn towards emotion, individualism, creativity, and a deep appreciation of nature. And I'm going to argue that a similar shift in cultural and critical perspective is needed if scientists and artists are going to have any chance, in collaboration, to affect enough of the population and in turn effect cultural and political awareness on matters of climate change. For me, the bridge between Romanticism and imagination and the Enlightenment and reason is most keenly personified by Kant, who is firmly associated with the Enlightenment, but on whose ideas subsequent Romantic artists and critics built so heavily that he is often considered one of the fathers of the movement. Oravec's take on the Kantian sublime, by way of Lyotard, is the most resonant modern analysis I found. She speaks of three stages. First, appreciation, in which the individual encounters an object larger and greater than the self. Second, awe, oppression, or even depression, in some versions fear or potential fear, in which the individual recognizes the relative greatness of the object and the relative weakness or limits of the self. And third, exaltation, in which the individual is conceptually or psychically enlarged as the greatness of the object is realized and the individual identifies with that greatness. So while we can start to think of the idea of the sublime landscape in deeply subjective terms, and I will go on to talk about the need for a balance between subjectivity, objectivity, and an ecocentric perspective in framing the Anthropocene cinematographically, these images illustrate that there are still key visual themes that we can look for in the sublime landscape. Nature and the environment as the central characters, the epic and panoramic in scale and scope, the human, be it a figure, a vessel, a ruined building, a track or pathway, a battle between darkness or shadow and light, specific use of the weather and the elements, the sun or the moon as primary lighting sources, a considered balance of the sky and land, themes of a journey in progress, a crossroads or a direction to be chosen, mythological, religious, or spiritual visual or narrative themes, and themes of isolation, desolation, or jeopardy. So, while a painting or a photograph might represent a transcendent moment in time, when approached cinematographically, both the cinematographer and the cinema viewer may experience a physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual journey towards, through, and beyond the sublime landscape moment. So, using the work of cinematographer Emanuel Lubetsky, I can start to illustrate how the addition of time and movement enables us to explore and frame the sublime landscape in new ways. Movement or animation within the landscape can include movement of figures through the landscape, movement within the environment, movement of weather, movement of light, for example in time-lapse sequences and in lens flare. And camera movement is also used to reframe, obscure, detail or reveal a sublime landscape. Tracking forward, becoming immersed in a landscape. Tracking backward, revealing the landscape. Tracking parallel, which for me is a definitive journey shot. Panning and tilting. Using a jib or crane, and The Revenant, for example, continually demonstrates this type of shot as a creative choice made over the use of Steadicam or tilting. Using a static, handheld, or stabilized camera. Using aerial cinematography, but movement is just one element in an arsenal of techniques available to the cinematographer who must use them all in considered and nuanced ways. Among them are lens selection, depth of field, and racking focus, color palette including color grading, editing, and the transference of meaning and emotion from one shot, for example of a face, to another, such as a landscape. Sound and score. Computer-generated imagery. Sensor size and resolution. And HDR or high dynamic range. Where once the sublime signified the human terror of nature and what it represented in spiritual and philosophical terms, the advent of the Anthropocene confirms that it is now nature that needs to be fearful of us. Emil Hines suggests that the Anthropocene is the age of man that announces its own extinction, while Parika elaborates that instead of the sudden apocalypse brought about by Vesuvius, our future fossils layers are piling up slowly but steadily as an emblem of an apocalypse in slow motion. In this way, it's impossible to reference the sublime landscape in the 21st century without starting to build an understanding of an anthropocentric ecosublime landscape as the visual representation of the human within the landscape of ecological catastrophe. The Revenant won 3 Oscars earlier this year and was roundly praised by critics. Director Iñárritu has spoken about the story representing the bloody beginnings of capitalism, and star DiCaprio famously used his Oscar acceptance speech to reference contemporary issues of climate change, both within the matter of the film and as a force that changed the shape of the production. But it's Lubetsky's photography that draws us in to the experiences and emotions of the characters, both the human and the landscape, in a deeply poetic way. And he does this through balancing a range of subjective points of view within his cinematography, which I'll explore in just a moment. Mad Max Fury Road won 6 Oscars. This is a film that is at its heart a post-apocalyptic road movie, and offers a deconstructed perspective of a future beyond the apocalypse, where resources are scarce and humans are ruled by evil overlords. So I use these mainstream examples to emphasize that the apocalyptic and the sublime landscape as a source of wonder and excitement are alive and kicking in our social conscience now more than ever. Hode suggests that while these movies might be escapist, they also conceal, Freud would have called it repress, the responsibilities and traumas of an adult society. And this feeds back into the concept of the sublime in distinctly Kantian terms, whereby we find great pleasure in witnessing or experiencing horror from a safe distance. We can be moved by terror and jeopardy as long as it's happening over there and to someone else. So we're back with subjectivity. Deleuze and Elkins argue that theorizing on landscape, which was once avowedly an ideological matter, has been increasingly replaced by a kind of de facto phenomenological understanding. Landscape is taken to be the most diffuse and dispersed, but also the most optimal occasion for meditating on the unity of the self. Landscape in this way of thinking is an exemplary encounter with subjectivity. So, in order to look at the subjectivity of the artist and of the viewer, I'm going to return to painting to look briefly at two specific romantic artists and how they treat the human within the sublime landscape. Firstly, we can look at Caspar David Friedrich for what I feel to be the most effective device for immersing the human subject and the viewer subjectively in his landscapes, and that is the Rückenfigure, or figure seen from behind. Simply by turning his human characters away from us and facing them to the landscape, Friedrich encourages us to either imagine ourselves in their position or following in their footsteps. In this way, the Rückenfigure suggests a deep communion with or relationship to the natural world that is rare in other romantic paintings. The human greatly affected by and immersed in nature. Friedrich was given to making seemingly self-evident statements like, "The artist's feeling are his law, and the artist should not only paint what he sees before him, but also what he sees within him." But at the heart of what he's saying is the observation that if one is to fully express oneself through art, one must be as aware of one's emotions as one is of one's thoughts. And secondly, J.M.W. Turner, who in the paintings he produced towards the end of his life, started to offer a first-person perspective highly suggestive of the human looking out directly onto nature, not framed and formally composed as a landscape painting, but rather images made in and of the elements, and therefore deeply rooted within the landscape itself. To push the idea of subjectivity in Turner's work even further, a piece like Seascape with Storm Coming On can be read as an invitation to the viewer to adopt an ecocentric perspective of the seascape, in an effort to imagine how nature might see itself. While the anthropocentric will be inherent in how we read the piece, the lack of the human in this work is striking. Now, if we take some of these ideas back into cinematography, staying with the work of Lubetzky, we can start to draw parallels and push the idea of a range of subjective narratives within the moving sublime landscape. Firstly, I suggest that there is a human or anthropocentric subjective in his work, defined by the use of wide lenses to get uncomfortably, unsparingly close to the human, as to create a landscape out of faces, hair, skin, hands, and clothes, in the same way as he does the textures of tree bark, sand, water, and plants. This draws us into a detailed world that we only ever experience in real life in a fundamentally subjective way. Secondly, there is an ecocentric, natural, or biocentric subjective. The use of either fluid, sweeping Steadicam shots or calm and well-composed static shots that represent an omnipotent or spiritual perspective. In some ways, these are objective points of view, but they can be read as giving nature, environment, and landscape an authentic voice, and de-anthropomorphizing the landscape by removing any trace of the human from the movement of the camera and frame. These shots also encourage us to reconsider landscape on its own terms and can be read as being resolutely post-human. And lastly, the symbiotic subjective, the balance and blending of the human and ecocentric subjectives, and this is how Lubetzky most confidently approaches his landscape and human subjects, in order to enable the greatest emotional resonance and connection between the cinematographer and the camera, the subject and the viewer. For me, this works most effectively when he employs Friedrich's Rückenfigure, which enables the cinematographer to represent their own direct experience of the landscape and the human within the narrative of a given film. And this encourages the viewer to look at the world from someone else's point of view. This is of vital importance, as Ingold talks about the temporality of landscape and the fact that it is often perceived as being over there and separate from us, the human, over here. Perhaps then the Rukun figure and the ecocentric perspective I've spoken of enable us to integrate the two subjects, the human and the landscape, by serving as an avatar through which we can virtually place ourselves within the landscape. And the Rukun figure runs through both the Revenant and Mad Max, pulling us into the harsh and unforgiving landscapes, into the cruelty of both nature and the human, and immersing us in the narrative experience of looking at the world through the eyes of another, promoting in us empathy and a yearning for connection to others. In this way, I suggest that the viewer is also encouraged to interact with and connect to the concept of the ecosublime landscape, and even to begin a discussion on where our responsibilities may lie as individuals and as groups, and in what ways we can start to move towards the ecosublime landscape with positivity and hope for the future of our place within it. So, I want to conclude by talking a little about my practice and my personal approach towards the sublime landscape, with a mind to framing the Anthropocene within my work. Firstly, I have had to come to terms with the fact that I am a romantic, and I've always been a romantic, but this has always been a problem in terms of the place of emotion in my work. Baudelaire declared romanticism to be precisely situated neither in the choice of subject nor in exact truth, but in a way of feeling. But the personal and subjective are at best problematic and at worst unreliable within intellectual or academic debate. So as a key part of my research process, I'm interrogating the value of the subjectivity of my experiences, or what Polanyi refers to as tacit knowledge, and Ingold as knowledge born of immediate experience or personal knowledge. And I do this by dissecting autoethnographic field notes, by observing the structural influences of affect theory within my process, by building on my own cinematographic craft and the cinematography of others, and by investigating film theory, art history, ecology, and the philosophical and cultural impacts of cinema and visual art in general in the age of the Anthropocene. But more than anything, I spend time in the landscape, walking it, lying in it, living with it, measuring the movement of light and tracking the weather. Herzog talks about learning to read the inner essence of a landscape, and to do that you need to be able to understand the practicalities of being in and working within a given space, at the same time as being aware of how your time in that space provokes thoughts and feelings that in turn change how you understand that landscape. Deleuze thinks of cinema in terms of time, and this is everything in my work. To observe and be a part of time within the landscape enables me to draw directly on my feelings, emotions, and thoughts, and then feed that into my work when I put a camera between myself and the landscape. As Tarkovsky himself says, what a person normally goes to the cinema for is time, for time lost or spent or not yet had. He goes there for living experience, for cinema, like no other, widens, enhances, and concentrates a person's experience. That is the power of cinema. And as Emmelheim suggests, we currently live in a time where our experiences have been hijacked or devalued in the name of capitalism. In an era of ubiquitous synthetic digital images, dissociated from human vision and directly tied to power and capital, when images and aesthetic experience have been turned into cognition and thus into empty sensations or tautological truths about reality, the image of the Anthropocene is still to come. With that in mind, I'll conclude with these final images from wildfires on Dartmoor, where the practice of swaling, that is the burning back of gorse and other wild shrubs to increase grazing land, has been observed for centuries. The day that I was there, I came across 3 fires that were burning out of control. They had been lit by farmers and landowners, they had been poorly managed, and the fire services from the surrounding towns and cities had to come in and extinguish the flames. This is a practice actively encouraged by the UK National Parks Authority, and it takes place every year, devastating ecosystems and releasing vast amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. While there is great potential for skepticism in the adoption of tautological terms like Anthropocene or ecosublime, I believe that they are largely positive concepts because, In the words of Schwartz, they offer us the chance, perhaps a final shot, of an age of responsibility, creativity, inventiveness, and humility. At a time when the evidence of science and our own eyes is so incredibly, overwhelmingly difficult to comprehend, what if at the end of the day, as artists, subjectivity is all we have? It's perhaps time that we accept that we're not going to be able to simply think our way out of this, that we're going to have to feel our way out too.